He was the commander-in-chief of feudal Japan, a military dictator with the strength and cunning to crush all enemies. For 7 centuries, he was the pinnacle of warrior society. Shogun, the supreme samurai.
At the center of virtually every chapter of Japanese medieval history, there was war and conflict. And at the center of the conflict was the daimyo, the local warlord. It was he who chose the fights, and he who led armies of men who drenched Japan in centuries of blood. Japan was ruled by an emperor, and the warlord served the royal court. That is until one day in the year 1192, when the nation paused and set off in a new direction. That was the day a warlord, Minamoto Yoritomo, declared himself shogun. While all Japan bowed their heads to the emperor, it was the shogun whose will ruled.
The shogun was the military dictator of Japan. The word is actually a shortened version of the full title, Seita Shogun, which literally means commander-in-chief for the suppression of barbarians. The barbarians being the enemies of the shogun.
In the Middle Ages, Japan was a group of islands with no central government. Instead, hundreds of local warlords carved their own small territories out of these misty hills and valleys. Warlords and their samurai fought among themselves year after year, decade after decade, for control of the scarce farmland. These two clans eventually met on the battlefield. It turned the countryside red with blood. One man, Minamoto Yoritomo, would emerge from this conflict to change the face of Japanese politics.
Minamoto Yoritomo must have been a very charismatic individual.
Yoritomo was the heir to a prominent warrior tradition, and his revolution was to inspire the samurais of Japan to sense their true power.
He simply said to his fellow warriors in the East, come fight for me, join my army, and in return, I will do for you what the court has been doing for you in terms of guaranteeing your status. But I'm a warrior like you are. I'm a provincial resident like you are. I'm not one of them. And he obviously touched off, or hit a nerve here. The timing was very good.
Yoritomo led his Minamoto clan in a struggle with their rivals of the 12th century, the Tairas. His armies were soon caught up in the great battles that became known as the Genpei Wars. And it was during the Great War between these two powerful clans that Minamoto Yoritomo saw his chance to dominate all Japan's warlords.
Yoritomo then emerged from the Genpei War as the officially recognized head of warrior society in Japan, the official head of the military and police systems for the court.
Yoritomo's government was called Bakufu, named after the tents that generals set up near the battlefield.
The great skill that Minamoto Yoritomo possessed was the skill of political adroitness, so that he could convert his military victories over the Taira into something more long-lasting. As a result, he set up a system of constables around the country, whereby these local samurai governors acted on his behalf, rather than having the centralized rule from the imperial palace and the imperial court.
Minamoto's loyal samurai warriors spread his influence throughout the country to make the point that his Bakufu government was in control. He set up his government in Kamakura, far from the emperor's imperial palace in Kyoto. It was his way of putting distance between the shogun and the emperor, to remove himself from the emperor's influence and to make a statement that the shogunate was a government of the samurai and not of the court. With this Bakufu rule, Yoritomo managed to do more for Japan than the emperors before him had ever achieved. Besides bringing the warring daimyos under his control, he created the first warrior government the Japanese people had ever known. In the process, he brought order to Japan, establishing a justice system fairer than anything that preceded it. Warriors took over tasks that the former bureaucrats of the imperial palace had been doing badly or corruptly. His loyal constables monitored everything from taxation to agriculture to military recruitment.
We generally see Yoritomo as the first important military figure to sort of initiate a long period of samurai involvement, if not outright control, of the political process in Japan.
The first shogun ruled with an iron fist, but knew how to be even-handed. When Yoritomo died in 1199, the tradition of the super warlord was established. But every shogun that followed knew what Yoritomo knew. The shogun would only survive if he was the wiliest fox in a forest of ambitious and dangerous warlords. A century and a half after the first shogun died, a new dynasty of military rulers rose to power, one which embodied the greatest strengths and the most profound weaknesses of the Bakufu government. The dynasty was called Ashikaga, and its members were descendants of the earliest shogun's Minamoto clan. The most glorious Ashikaga was Yoshimitsu. He was the first shogun to use war as a means toward peace. Yoshimitsu had learned well the lesson of the first shogun. What separated the shogun from the other warlords was his cunning mind. For Japan was still rife with territorial disputes. To put an end to these rivalries, indeed to survive, would take a master diplomat. In 1392, two rival clans pitted huge samurai armies against each other, as each claimed one of its heirs emperor of all Japan. As a result, there was the emperor of the north and an emperor of the south. Yoshimitsu called the two rival clan leaders together for a meeting. Through negotiations that were full of ceremony and courtly manners, he played on their sense of pride and honor. Perhaps, he suggested, they could work out an arrangement in which each party got his wish. Both clans could have an emperor.
Yoshimitsu brought the wars to an end, not so much by a military victory, but by negotiation, whereby the succession between the two lines would alternate. That satisfied the competing warlords and brought peace to Japan.
Yoshimitsu is known to us historically far more as a patron of the arts than he is as a military figure, even though it was during his particular tenure as shogun that the endemic warfare that had been going on in Japan for several decades was brought to a halt, as he brought the northern and the southern courts together again. But really, we think of him as a patron of the arts, of a collector of fine Chinese art goods and library.
Shogun Yoshimitsu, the negotiator and the peacemaker, brought Japan into a brief but significant era of peace. Under his rule, the arts flourished. Without the fear of conquest and battle, calligraphy, poetry, and music developed as they never had before.
During Yoshimitsu's reign and during his lifetime, the shogun's court actually supplanted the imperial court as not only the seat of political power in Japan, but also as the seat of cultural norms and cultural ideals.
During the peaceful rule of Yoshimitsu and his successors, the tea ceremony developed. As the tea ceremony celebrates the beauty and tranquility of everyday life, so Yoshimitsu's life was lived in peace, proving that a warlord, a shogun, the man with the ultimate power of life and death in Japan, could cultivate the arts as carefully as he had outmaneuvered his enemies. Yoshimitsu transformed the capital Kyoto into a magnificent city of temples and gardens.
One of his most famous artistic accomplishments is the creation of what's called the Golden Pavilion, a fairly elaborate and very expensive temple complex in the capital city.
Here, Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, the arbiter of taste, held poetry parties, flower viewing parties, established and largely developed the tea ceremony, and entertained emperors, courtiers, and ambassadors from China.
If the high point of Muromachi warrior government came under Yoshimitsu, his successors were not so fortunate. By the time we reached the 8th shogun Yoshimasa, already things had begun to unravel rather severely, and Yoshimasa was not able to preside over a very powerful warrior government at all.
While the shogun concerned himself with poetry and flowers, rival clans schemed to seize power. Soon, all of Japan was caught up in a bloody civil war. Kyoto itself became a battleground.
And we have skirmishes where one group goes out and burns out the buildings of one particular group, and then there are counterattacks, and buildings of the other group are burned down. And again, the commoners' lives, the people who lived in the city of Kyoto, were affected in ways that they had never been in previous battles.
The citizens of Kyoto began to evacuate the city. Invading armies confiscated their empty houses. Barricades appeared in the streets. Opposing samurai warriors dug trenches facing each other along the city's grand avenues.
And within a short space of time, this beautiful city, which consisted of buildings built largely of wood, was reduced to blackened ashes.
While Yoshimasa devoted his energies to a courtly life of tea ceremonies, flower viewing parties, and poetry readings, outside the palace walls, the ravages of the Onin War spread destruction throughout Japan.
In fact, the war really never ended. Instead, it sort of petered out in the capital and drifted off into the provinces. And warriors established themselves as more or less autonomous provincial barons and fight one another on a fairly constant basis.
It was time for a true warrior to help steer the nation back on the road to peace.